Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another lesson. The previous time we talked about how to describe the different peoples of the Ottoman Empire. Again, we have to think about the Ottoman Empire as an empire. What does an empire mean? Well, in some ways, it's quite different from the type of polities we live in today. That is a nation state for the most part, in which usually most people in a nation state are supposed to be homogenous, like France, right? People in France are supposed to speak French. They're all supposed to be French. Of course, there's immigration and so forth. But we forget there's also the process in a nation state like France of making everyone French. Because before they weren't all French. There were different people, Bretons, other people speaking different varieties of French. Anyways, my point being is that in an empire, there just simply isn't that same desire to homogenize, to make everyone French, or to make everyone, in this case, Turkish or Ottoman, whatever the ruling group is. And instead, you have all these different people living together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes not harmoniously, in the borders of this place. And what I want to kind of just give you a sense is who is in this land, the Ottoman Empire. So the previous time we talked about nomads. Now what we're going to talk about more traditionally is basically kind of look at how people broke down in terms of religion. So not nomad versus settled populations, but let's say, well, Muslims we'll talk about in the next class, but different types of Christians, Jews. So let's begin with Christians. So if you remember, or if you might know from high school history or anything, the area we're talking about, most of this area in this map here, right? This is all basically the Byzantine Empire, or the Roman Empire. Because the Byzantines, they didn't call themselves Byzantines, they called themselves Romans because they saw themselves correctly as a continuation of the Roman Empire. Of course, they didn't use Latin. They decided they switched over to Greek in the 4th century. But this is basically the extent of this eastern half is supposedly the Byzantine Empire at 565. Of course, with the coming of Islam around 622, 630, they lose kind of this part. This part gets invaded by barbarians, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Byzantine Empire is left with something more like this around the year 1000. Where you have, again, essentially the Ottoman Empire is in some ways reconstructing the core of Byzantine control. You have the Balkans, all the way up to what's today essentially Croatia, the boot of Italy, and Anatolia. The Ottomans never take this. By the way, they just kind of have a few places. But and there's the Crimea over here. So basically a sort of Black Sea, Mediterranean, Aegean Sea sort of polity. Now, what ends up happening, and this is important, in 1071, there's this battle that we talked about last time, right? So these Seljuks over here, they're a sort of quasi-nomadic polity. They started off nomadic, then they became more, let's say, settled. And then they had these other waves of Turkish nomads coming in, and they kind of pushed them off to the border so that they wouldn't raid these cities like Baghdad, Damascus. But then this created new troubles because now all of a sudden these nomads were sort of dragging them into war against the Byzantines because the Byzantines said, no, come on, stop raiding our boundaries, et cetera. In any case, the Seljuk come, they're not even looking for war. They sort of make a peace treaty with them, they're betrayed by the Byzantines, blah, blah. They end up fighting the Byzantines and they soundly defeat them. The emperor of the Byzantines, I don't remember which one this is captured or killed. And from that point on, the interior of the peninsula, the interior of Asia Minor is essentially an open ground for Turkic nomads and for the Seljuk state to kind of establish itself. And if you remember the map that we were looking at a few lessons ago, they actually kind of, there's kind of raids and set all the way to the coast. In fact, the very first written inscription we have, evidence we have of Turkish presence is, let's say 20, 30 years after this battle. There's a gravestone somewhere in a castle here on the sea, a Turkish gravestone or Muslim gravestone that was essentially taken up and then built into castle walls, taken as what's called spolia. And the Byzantines kind of took it, used it as marble, and then kind of stuck it onto into a castle wall where you can still see it today. So this is kind of the earliest written proof of the presence of these people, not that there's much. In any case, the Byzantines take back this coast, and then the Byzantine Empire is essentially, this area plus the coast of Asia Minor. But then another kind of major tragedy for the Byzantine occurs in the Fourth Crusade, which takes place in 1202, 1204. This is a painting, I believe, from a church in France. I can't remember exactly where, but it kind of depicts the Crusader armies being easily distracted, more interested in actually sacking and destroying Constantinople than they were about going to the Muslim Middle East and trying to conquer it. And they end up sacking and just basically looting massively Constantinople. Sorry, as I was saying, this was a disastrous attack for the Byzantines. It utterly split apart the empire, as we can see in here, because the Latins, that is the Western Europeans, people coming from France, Italy, Germany, other places, essentially established their own kingdom here, at least for a few decades, and the Byzantines had to essentially move over here to the empire, this kind of empire of Nicaea. Basically, their empire got split up into a bunch of three little empires. Despotate of Epirus, small little side kingdom. Most of it was here. The capital was here, Nicaea, called Iznik in Turkey. And then there was another one on the Black Sea coast. And eventually they're able to take back this area, but it took them quite a few times. So, as you probably know, the Byzantines continued on. Essentially, by the 15th century, so kind of by 1400, they were just in Constantinople here, and then had a little piece of the Black Sea near Trabzon. But otherwise, they continued on for a long time. And in fact, the Ottomans, when they began to start, they were one of the Turkish tribes. They got pushed all the way to the frontier, so all the way to this area, Iznik, Nicaea. They're right in this region. In fact, some of the very first raids were on Iznik by this point, which was a major city, but the capital had gone back to Constantinople. So one of the things we can think about is, well, what exactly was the Byzantine legacy on the Ottoman Empire? What did they end up taking? How did they continue to see themselves in the ways that the Byzantines continued to, let's say, define their empire or their legacy? To what degree did the Ottomans end up continuing the Byzantine Empire? Because one of the interesting things is actually, for the very first time, if we look back at this map of the Byzantine/Roman Empire, the Ottomans basically recreate the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. They're the first ones since early Muslims in the 7th century broke apart Eastern Mediterranean into a kind of Muslim and Christian area. The Ottomans were the first ones to kind of reunite this whole area into one unified political sphere. There's other things we'll talk about. For example, how did the Ottomans conceive themselves? But they didn't call themselves Ottomans. They actually, as a ethnicity, they called themselves Rum, that is, Romans, not because they literally saw themselves as Romans, but because they were living in the lands of Rum, the Roman lands, that is the Byzantine lands. And they ended up creating their own kind of version of an identity based on Turkish speech and elite culture. But we'll talk about that in a future discussion. The other interesting question to think about is, well, what happened to all the people that were living in the Byzantine Empire? I mean, they were all basically Christians, in some ways, speaking Greek. What is going to happen then in the wake of these waves of Turkish Muslim migration and often conquest. And ultimately, the question is that most of the population of the Ottoman Empire remained Christian. And at least until the 17th century, the majority of it was Christian. So we always have to keep that in mind, that the majority of the population of the Ottoman Empire for a long time was not Muslim. And even then, even by the end, by the 19th century, still a very large 30, 40, 30, at least 30% of it was not Muslim. Of course, there are many other, let's say, linguistic groups other than Greeks, or people speaking Greek, Greek Orthodox Christians, if you will, in the former lands of the Byzantine and the Ottoman Empire. There's in fact many different types of Christians that ended up being in this area. People that were really not even ever in the Byzantine Empire. On one hand, we have Slavs, various Slavic people here. And they spoke, I mean, they were Christians. They probably, like at a colloquial level, they spoke Slavic, one form of Slavic or another. But when they needed to learn a learned language, when they needed like an ecclesiastical language, they always turned to Greek, right? So Greek became the language that united many Christians together. On the other hand, if we looked at further down here in what's today essentially the Arab lands, we have a variety of other Christians, kind of Arabic-speaking Christians of various sorts, and specifically in Egypt, Coptic Christians who have actually a Coptic language, which is vaguely close to ancient Egyptian, the original language of the ancient Egyptians, but they also spoke Arabic and wrote in Arabic often. So in these areas, basically from here, this lands that were previously the Mamluk Empire, they were Christians spoke Arabic mostly. And finally, there were Armenians, and I want to stop and pause a bit more about who the Armenians are. So if we look back at this map from the wake of the Fourth Crusade, which kind of sacked Constantinople and split up the Byzantine Empire. If you look down here on the right, there's an Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. So Armenians, if you might know, are essentially one of, I mean, according to their own lore, the first nation or peoples that converted to Christianity as a whole, which I believe they did so in a century or even earlier. And for the most part, Armenians traditionally, and this is true in the early medieval period too, is that they were living in essentially today Eastern Anatolia, Eastern Turkey, and today the modern nation state of Armenia, in other parts of the Caucasus, northern Iran, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they're basically Christians, but they have a liturgy and a church hierarchy that's essentially all run in Armenia. On the left here is a costume album trying to depict what Armenians look like. They also have their own alphabet, which is different from the Greek or Coptic or Ethiopic alphabets. And there's a lot of Armenians around. And the interesting thing is we'll talk about later in the class, initially in the first centuries of Ottoman rule, 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, Armenians are predominantly in Eastern Anatolia. So let's go back to the map. They're over here. There's Armenia, this area this is where a lot of Armenians live. And there's a lot of ancient Armenian castles, towns. If you ever get a chance to go to the city of Ani, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing medieval Armenian city, which is in ruins, but has been preserved as ruins. It's a very impressive place to go to. But over the course of the 17th century, due to rural instability and bandits and attacks by Ottomans and by Iran's Safavids, the Armenians started to migrate. On one hand, they migrated into Iran, And in fact, here we can see in this little vignette, a meeting with the Safavid Shah, who ultimately takes, as he destroys a lot of areas in Armenia, he takes the Armenian peoples living there and moves them back to his new capital and creates a new city, a city called New Julfa, after the old Julfa, which was in the Caucasus. But a lot of them are also basically moving out westward to the western cities of the Ottoman Empire, places like Constantinople or Istanbul, Izmir, Thessaloniki, and a few other places, looking for basically a new life opportunity. They're refugees fleeing rural instability. And from there, they end up also moving off into different parts of Western Europe. And this map, which you can see, I just gave a part of it, is a gigantic scroll that a Western diplomat, Luigi Marsili, requested from an Armenian intellectual named Eremia Çelebi. And it's a gigantic, I mean, it's really big. It's a very big scroll that would take up, it's maybe, I don't know, 4 meters long by 1.5 meters wide. It's gigantic. If you unroll it, it takes up an entire giant table. And what he did is essentially create a sort of map stretching from Iran, this corner, to the Ottoman, to Istanbul, and kind of listed all the different holy sites, towns, places of Armenian importance throughout Anatolia in 1680. And you can get a sense of just how heavily an Anatolian landscape was embedded with Armenian sites and Armenian villages. Now, if we look today, where are Armenians? You can see based on this density map, there are a few countries that have heavy populations of Armenians. The most important are the US and Russia. Now, how did people in Armenia, Iran, Turkey, et cetera, how did people end up from here going to the rest of the world? Well, some of it is, some of it is just migration. So as I said, people were deported from Julfa and moved to Isfahan to be in this new suburb called New Julfa. And from there, they became kind of state merchants for the Safavid Empire and traveled all over the Indian Ocean to all sorts of different places, created an Armenian diaspora that was trading basically from Southeast Asia, India especially, and around this whole littoral of the Indian Ocean with Iran. Then there's also, as I said, Armenians that fled westward towards the coastal cities of Anatolia. And from there, they also created a merchant diaspora that often stretched to many parts of Europe, et cetera. But what we're looking at here is essentially the population transfers and effects following and before the Armenian genocide. So as the numbers in the 19th to 20th century, the traditional, let's say, difficulties is with tolerance, not because there wasn't tolerance, historians don't like it for a variety of reasons, but the traditional space of tolerance for all sorts of different nationalities / religions was kind of undone by a variety of wars and pogroms and things like that. And this culminated in basically the Armenian genocide during World War I, in which many Armenians living in eastern Turkey, but also in other parts of Anatolia, were essentially kind of marched into the desert, forced death march, often killed, et cetera, et cetera. The ones that survived, many made it into the desert, into Syria, Lebanon, or they fled elsewhere. So basically this eliminated the Armenian population in Anatolia, which was significant. And many of them, both before and after the genocide, fled. Many went to different parts of the Arab world, here, like Egypt and Syria, et cetera. Lebanon has a very large menu. But others went, for example, to the Caucasus. Many were already working and tied into the Russian Empire, which is extending very heavily into the Caucasus. But most importantly, they went to America. And one of the places that they end up settling is Fresno, California, where there's in Glendale, other places in California where there's a very large Armenian community in diaspora. And from there to other parts, other places that are important is Watertown, which is a neighborhood of Boston, or it's a little city on the side of Boston. And so Armenian communities became most prosperous in the US, but also there's a lot of prominent Armenians in Russia and the former Soviet lands. The Iranian communities, a lot of is basically remnants from the deportations in the 17th century. And of course, like places like France, Australia, Argentina, or other migratory communities that came after the genocide. Okay, as I mentioned, there's also Coptic Christians. They live in Egypt. They actually basically, as you see in this picture of St. George, St. Theodore, killing an oppressor. This is the King Daklan al-Kafir, the infidel King Daklan, dressed as a sort of Ottoman Pasha type. They actually write in Arabic. They have their own Coptic language for very advanced liturgy, but they mostly, they basically, these are Arabic-speaking Christians with their own church tied to the Ethiopian church, which live in Egypt. And then there's other Arabic-speaking communities throughout the Arab lands. Finally, I do want to talk a bit about Jews. So who were the Jews living in the Ottoman Empire? First, before, we have to say that the majority of Jews living in the empire actually came from Iberia. That is, the area called Spain and Portugal. Why is that? Because in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed out towards the Americas, Isabel and Ferdinand completed the conquest of Spain. That means the last Muslim kingdom, Al-Andalus, that is Granada, was taken over. And while initially the Muslims were allowed to stay, the Jews were immediately expelled. And in 1492, there's a proclamation that all the Jews in this area, in Spain and eventually Portugal, were forced to either convert to stay, convert to Christianity, or had to leave. And so many left. And over the course of the 16th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, we get a variety of Jews moving. Some went to Italy, as you can see in this map. A lot of them went to North Africa, basically what's today Morocco, Algeria, Tunis. But the largest part actually sought refuge and was granted refuge by the Ottoman Sultan to settle in the Ottoman Empire. Where did they go? They went to basically two cities, Salonika and Istanbul. But they also came to other parts of the area, basically places like Jerusalem and Cairo, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there were actually Jews already in the Ottoman Empire. So, for example, there were a lot of Jews in the Arabic-speaking lands, Egypt, for example. There was all sorts of Arabic-speaking Jews. There was also Greek-speaking Jews who were living in the Byzantine Empire and continued to live under the Ottomans, but their community was relatively small. So, when this Spanish-speaking community, so these Spanish Jews, what we call Sephardic Jews, moved into the Ottoman Empire. One, they had their own language, which is called Ladino, but it's really just Spanish, written in Hebrew characters. You can call it Judeo-Spanish if you want. And they had a better structure, and they were, even though they were fleeing, they still were much richer and much more well-connected. In the sense, they became the dominant element among the different Jewish communities that existed in the Ottoman Empire. And essentially, Judeo-Spanish and Hebrew became the main languages of Jews at the time. So, just to give an overview, we're basically looking at different non-Muslim groups that were religious communities that were present in the Ottoman Empire. Muslim sects we're going to talk about in the next episode, but there's basically different forms of Christianity Greek Orthodox, which included Greeks, Slavs, other people, Armenian Orthodox, which is again Christians. They're Orthodox Christians, but they have their own church. They have their own hierarchy. They have their own kind of center, et cetera, et cetera. There's Syrians, who we didn't, Syriacs, who we didn't talk about, Coptics, and eventually, starting in the 1630s, Catholics. In terms of Jews, there's two major sects of Jews, but I was just talking about this rabbinic one, and we'll talk about this Muslim sect stuff in a bit. Until next time, I will see you soon.